Some people think first love fades with time. They're wrong. Sometimes it just waits for the one moment that breaks your heart all over again. I almost turned my car around 3 different times before I finally pulled into the parking lot of Westbrook High School. The brick building looked smaller than I remembered, as if 10 years had quietly worn away the power it once held over my life. The football field lights glowed beyond the gym, and strings of warm white lights hung across the entrance where a banner welcomed the class of 2016 back home. I sat behind the steering wheel with both hands resting on it, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. I had spent a decade convincing myself that coming back here would never matter. I had built a quiet life in Seattle, taught art to middle school students who believed every painting deserved another chance, rented a cozy apartment overlooking Lake Union, and learned how to smile whenever people asked if I was seeing anyone. My answers always sounded convincing enough, even to me. Yet the moment I crossed the city limits that afternoon, every carefully stacked memory inside me shifted like loose boxes in an attic. Claire had spent weeks persuading me to attend the reunion, insisting everyone wanted to see me again, insisting that enough time had passed. Maybe it had for everyone else. I adjusted the collar of my navy jacket and checked my reflection one last time before stepping out into the cool October air. The smell of fallen leaves mixed with fresh coffee drifting from a food truck parked near the entrance. Laughter floated across the parking lot as former classmates hugged, compared careers, introduced spouses, and pointed excitedly toward old teachers. I recognized faces that had changed just enough to make me hesitate before remembering their names. The years had softened everyone, except the memories I carried. Inside the auditorium, framed photographs from senior year lined the walls. A playlist of songs from our graduation year echoed through the room, while conversations blended into a comfortable hum. I accepted a plastic cup of sparkling cider from the refreshment table and tried to lose myself among familiar extraños. Then something made me stop. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a name. It was the strange feeling that someone had just walked into the room carrying a part of my past I had buried alive. I slowly turned toward the display of old class photos near the back wall. A man stood there with his hands tucked into the pockets of a charcoal coat, studying one particular picture with an expression so quiet it almost hurt to look at. His dark hair was shorter now, his shoulders broader. A faint scar rested above his left eyebrow, exactly where I remembered it from the day he crashed his bike trying to impress me sophomore year. Even before I saw his face completely, my heart recognized him. Noah Bennett, my first love. The boy who promised we would leave this town together after graduation. The boy who kissed me beneath the empty bleachers the night before everything changed. The boy who never showed up the next morning. My fingers loosened around the cup until cold cider spilled across my hand. I barely noticed. Every sound in the auditorium drifted farther away, swallowed by the pounding of my heartbeat. Noah hadn't seen me yet. He was still looking at the old photograph, gently turning something over in his hand. When he lifted it toward the light, I felt every breath leave my body. It was the faded brown leather bracelet I had braided for him during our senior year art class. I remembered tying it around his wrist and laughing because the knot looked crooked. I remembered him promising he would never take it off. 10 years later, it was still there. Before I could move, I heard him speak quietly to the man standing beside him. "I came back for him once," he said, his voice older but unmistakably the same. He was already gone. I stood frozen long after Noah's words disappeared into the noise of the reunion. They echoed inside me with impossible weight, pushing against a belief I had carried for 10 years. I came back for him once. He was already gone. My mind rejected the sentence before my heart had a chance to believe it. It had to be a misunderstanding. It had to be something I had overheard out of context. Because if Noah had truly come back for me, then everything I had spent a decade accepting about my past was built on the wrong story. I looked away before he could turn around and notice me. My pulse refused to slow as I slipped through the crowd toward the refreshment table, pretending to study a tray of cookies that no one seemed interested in eating. The room felt warmer than it had only minutes before. Someone laughed loudly near the stage where a slideshow cycled through old yearbook photos. Familiar faces flashed across the large screen, smiling with the confidence only teenagers possess, convinced that life would always wait for them. I spotted my own senior portrait for a brief second. Standing beside me in the picture was Noah, wearing that crooked smile he always gave whenever the photographer told him to look serious. I quickly looked away. "Ethan," Claire's cheerful voice pulled me back into the present. She wrapped me in a quick hug before I had time to prepare. "I was beginning to think you were not coming." I forced a smile. "I almost did not." She laughed. "I knew you would. You always kept your promises, even when you pretended not to care." The words landed harder than she intended. I always kept my promises. My eyes drifted across the auditorium until they found Noah again. He was talking with two former classmates near the display table. He looked comfortable, almost relaxed. Yet every few seconds his gaze wandered across the room as though he was searching for someone. I immediately looked away before our eyes could meet. Claire nudged my shoulder. "You have not changed much. That is generous." "No, really. You still disappear into corners whenever there is a crowd." I smiled politely. Some habits survive adulthood. She tilted her head, studying me with the same perceptive expression she had worn since high school. "You saw him already, did not you?" I did not answer. I did not have to. Claire sighed softly. "I wondered how long it would take." "Did you know he was coming?" I asked. "I knew he accepted the invitation last month." My stomach tightened. "And you never thought to mention that? If I had told you, would you have come?" I opened my mouth before realizing there was no honest answer that did not embarrass me. Claire smiled with quiet sympathy. "That is what I thought." She gently squeezed my arm before someone else called her name from across the room. "Do not leave too early, okay? There's still a few surprises tonight." As she disappeared into another conversation, I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself. 10 years had taught me how to control almost every emotion except this one. I had survived moving across the country with 2 suitcases. I had survived lonely birthdays, difficult jobs, and watching friends build families while convincing myself that love belonged to another version of my life. I had survived believing Noah Bennett chose to forget me. That belief had hurt, but at least it had been simple. His words had shattered that simplicity in less than 10 seconds. I reached into my jacket pocket, searching for my phone, mostly to give my hand something to do. Before I could unlock the screen, I felt the unmistakable sensation of someone standing just behind me. Even without turning around, I recognized the quiet stillness that always surrounded him. Then I heard the voice I'd spent 10 years trying to forget. "Ethan." My name sounded exactly the way it had when we were 18, gentle enough to stop time itself. I closed my eyes for one brief second before turning to face him. I turned slowly, every movement feeling heavier than it should have. Noah stood only a few feet away, close enough for me to notice details that photographs and memories had never captured. There were faint lines at the corners of his eyes that appeared when he offered a cautious smile. His charcoal coat fit the broad shoulders that years had quietly shaped, yet his eyes were exactly the same deep shade of blue I remembered from countless autumn afternoons spent talking beneath the old oak tree behind the library. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The reunion continued around us with cheerful conversations, clinking glasses, and music from another decade, but everything beyond the space between us faded into something distant and unreal. Noah was the first to break the silence. Ethan. His voice was calm, almost careful, as though he had rehearsed those 2 words 1,000 times. "It has been a long time." I searched his face for anger, regret, guilt, anything that matched the years I'd spent rebuilding myself after he disappeared. Instead, I found only quiet exhaustion. 10 years, I answered. He nodded slowly. "Yes, 10 years." Another silence settled between us, uncomfortable but strangely familiar. It reminded me of the quiet moments we used to share without feeling the need to fill every second with conversation. Back then, silence had been peaceful. Now it carried questions too heavy for either of us to ask. Noah glanced toward the photograph display before looking back at me. "You look well." I almost laughed. It was the same harmless sentence people always used when they had no idea what else to say. "You would not know," I replied before I could stop myself. The words came out sharper than I intended. His expression changed almost imperceptibly, not with anger, but with something that looked painfully close to disappointment. He accepted the remark without defending himself. "You are right," he said quietly. "I would not." I looked away first. If I kept staring at him, I was afraid I would begin believing that he was just another stranger instead of the person who had once known every dream I had. Noah shifted his weight slightly, sliding one hand into his coat pocket. I noticed he still rubbed his thumb against the edge of the leather bracelet whenever he was nervous. That tiny habit struck me harder than anything else. People were supposed to change after 10 years. They were not supposed to carry invisible pieces of the past into the future. "Claire told me you teach art now," Noah said. "Middle school. Do you enjoy it?" I hesitated before answering honestly. "Most days." A small smile appeared on his face. "I always thought you would become an artist. Life has a way of changing plans." He nodded with understanding that seemed deeper than the conversation itself. "Yes, it does." I folded my arms across my chest, unsure whether I wanted to protect myself from him or from the memories standing beside him. "What about you?" I asked. "Claire mentioned you. Became an architect." "Chicago," he answered. "I have been there for several years." "Do you like it?" He looked toward the windows where the lights from the football field reflected against the glass. It never felt like home. Before I could respond, someone called Noah's name from across the room. He acknowledged them with a brief wave, but made no move to leave. Instead, he looked directly at me again, his expression more serious now than at any point since we had spoken. "There is something I have wanted to ask you for a very long time." My heartbeat quickened despite every effort to remain composed. "What?" He took a slow breath, as though the question carried more weight than it should have. "Did you ever get my letter?" For a second, I simply stared at him, unable to process what he had said. Then a bitter laugh escaped before I could stop it. "Your letter?" I repeated. "Noah, you disappeared without a word. Do not stand here after 10 years pretending there was a letter." His face lost what little color remained. He did not argue. He did not become defensive. He only whispered, almost to himself, "Then you never knew." The question hung between us like a door that had suddenly appeared in the middle of a familiar room. "Did you ever get my letter?" I wanted to dismiss it, to tell him it did not matter anymore, but something in his face refused to let me. It was not the expression of someone inventing an excuse. It was the look of a man who had expected a different answer for far too many years. Before I could respond, applause erupted from the front of the auditorium as the principal welcomed everyone back. The microphone squealed briefly, pulling every guest's attention toward the stage. Noah glanced in that direction, then back at me. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "This is not how I imagined seeing you again." I folded my arms tighter. "You imagined seeing me again?" He opened his mouth as though he wanted to explain, but someone interrupted to congratulate him on an award his architecture firm had recently received. He answered politely, never once taking his eyes completely off me. I used the distraction to step away, needing air more than answers. The hallway outside the auditorium was almost empty. Old championship banners still hung from the ceiling, faded by time, but somehow untouched by memory. I walked toward the trophy case near the gymnasium, the same hallway where Noah and I used to race after school because he insisted he could beat me even while carrying both of our backpacks. I smiled before I realized I was smiling. The memory arrived without permission. I was 17 again, sitting in the art room after classes had ended, trying to finish a charcoal sketch before the regional competition deadline. My pencil snapped in half, and frustration washed over me because I could not afford another set until my weekend shift at the bookstore. Noah had quietly walked over without saying a word and placed his own pencils beside my drawing. "You always press too hard," he had teased with that crooked grin. "Maybe because I care too much," I answered. He laughed softly. "That is exactly why your drawings are better than mine." I remembered looking up at him then, sunlight pouring through the classroom windows, catching tiny flecks of graphite on his fingers. He had never been the best artist, but he always stayed after school anyway because he knew I hated working alone. Sometimes he pretended to draw while secretly watching me concentrate. When I finally noticed, he would look away so dramatically that it always made me laugh. Another memory followed before I could stop it. We were lying on the football field one cool September evening after everyone else had gone home. The grass scratched the backs of our jackets while we stared at the stars beginning to appear above the stadium lights. Noah pointed toward the sky and declared that one day we would leave Westbrook together. He wanted to design buildings that made people feel hopeful. I wanted to paint murals large enough to remind strangers that beauty could exist in ordinary places. We spent hours planning apartments we could never afford, cities we had never visited, and futures that seemed only one graduation ceremony away. It all felt possible because we believed possibility was enough. The final memory came with such clarity that it stole my breath. The night before graduation, we stood beneath the empty bleachers after the senior celebration ended. The entire campus had gone quiet except for the distant hum of sprinklers watering the football field. Noah reached into his pocket and pulled out the leather bracelet that I had braided during art class. I laughed because the knot was uneven. He asked me to tie it around his wrist anyway. When I finished, he looked at it for a long moment before meeting my eyes. "Tomorrow morning," he said softly. 6 o'clock at the bus station. We leave together. I nodded without hesitation. Then he stepped closer and rested his forehead gently against mine. Neither of us needed grand promises because we believed tomorrow belonged to us. I closed my eyes in the empty hallway, remembering how certain we had been. We had not known that by sunrise, certainty would become the one thing neither of us would ever find again. The hallway suddenly felt too small to hold everything I was remembering. I rested one hand against the cool glass of the trophy case and watched my own reflection stare back at me, older than I ever imagined, carrying questions that should have been answered before I turned 20. "I hope you would still come here when you needed to think." Noah's voice was quiet enough that it almost blended into the silence. I turned and found him standing several feet away, giving me enough space to leave if I wanted. It was a small gesture, but I noticed it immediately. The Noah I remembered always knew when to step closer and when to wait. "You should not have followed me," I said. "I thought if I waited another 10 years, that might be worse." His answer caught me off guard. I looked at him carefully, searching for the confidence I had expected from someone who had built a successful career. Instead, I found uncertainty, the kind that only comes from carrying regret for a very long time. "You asked about a letter," I said. "There was no letter, Noah. There was only an empty bus station." He lowered his eyes for a moment. "I know what you saw." "No," I answered, unable to hide the pain that had waited so many years to speak. "You do not know what I saw." I stood there until almost noon. Every bus that arrived made me think you would step off. Every bus that left made me wonder if I had somehow missed you. My voice remained calm, but my chest felt painfully tight. I kept telling myself there had to be a reason. Then the days became weeks. Eventually, I accepted that I had simply believed someone who changed his mind. Noah closed his eyes briefly before looking back at me. "I never changed my mind." I almost laughed again, but there was no humor left inside me. "You expect me to believe that?" "I expect nothing from you," he replied softly. "Not anymore." His honesty made it harder to stay angry. Before I could respond, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Rachel Bennett appeared around the corner, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. She stopped the instant she saw me. For a second, surprise crossed her face before it melted into something that looked remarkably like relief. "Ethan," she whispered, "I was hoping you came." I had always liked Rachel. She was 3 years older than Noah and had treated me like family long before I deserved it. She smiled gently, then looked from me to her brother. "I should probably leave you two alone." Noah shook his head. "It is okay." Rachel hesitated before handing one of the coffee cups to Noah. "I just wanted to tell you that Claire is asking everyone to gather in the library in about 15 minutes. They are opening the class time capsule." She turned toward me again, and for a brief moment, it seemed like she wanted to say something else. Instead, she only smiled sadly. "It is good to see you again." After she walked away, I watched Noah staring down at the untouched coffee in his hands. "She always liked you," he said. "I like her too." Another silence settled between us. Finally, I asked the question that had been lingering in my mind ever since Claire mentioned his name earlier that evening. Someone told me you were engaged a few years ago. Noah remained still. What happened? He looked straight at me, his expression open in a way I had almost forgotten. I ended it because I realized I was trying to build a future while pretending my heart had never stayed behind it. Westbrook, my breath caught before I could stop it. He continued quietly, without taking a single step closer. It was not fair to her. She deserved someone who could love her completely. I could not become that person. I searched his face for any sign that he was saying what he thought I wanted to hear. There was none. Just before I could answer, Claire's voice echoed through the hallway, inviting everyone into the old library to open the time capsule we had buried on graduation week. Neither of us knew that inside that forgotten metal box waited the first piece of evidence that both of our memories had been missing the same impossible truth. The old library smelled exactly the way I remembered, a mixture of aging paper, polished wood, and dust that seemed untouched by time. The shelves had been rearranged, the furniture replaced, but the silence still carried the same quiet comfort it always had when I was a student hiding there between classes. Nearly everyone from our graduating class gathered in a loose circle around a folding table where a weathered metal box rested beneath the bright ceiling lights. Claire smiled as she placed both hands on the lid. 10 years ago, every one of us left something here for our future selves, she said. Letters, photographs, little reminders of who we thought we would become. Tonight, we finally get them back. Soft laughter spread through the room as she carefully lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of sealed envelopes stacked neatly beside small keepsakes wrapped in tissue paper. People applauded as names were called one by one. Some opened their letters immediately, laughing at old dreams that had changed with adulthood. Others quietly slipped them into jackets, saving the moment for later. I stood near the back, hoping my turn would come quickly. Ethan Carter. Claire handed me a cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front in familiar handwriting. At almost the same moment, she smiled toward the other side of the room. Noah Bennett. Noah stepped forward and accepted an envelope that looked almost identical to mine. For one strange second, our eyes met before we both looked away. I ran my thumb across the faded paper. The edges had yellowed with age, but the seal remained intact. Taking a slow breath, I opened it carefully. Instead of recognizing my own handwriting, I froze. Every line on the page belonged to Noah. I knew the shape of his letters instantly. My pulse quickened. There had to be some mistake. Around me, conversations continued, but the room faded as I began reading. If you were reading this, then hopefully we both kept our promise to leave Westbrook together. If not, maybe life became more complicated than we imagined. There is something I have never been brave enough to tell you out loud. The truth is that I fell in love with you long before that night beneath the bleachers. I think I started loving you the day you handed me a broken paintbrush and told me every mistake could become part of the picture. If tomorrow changes everything, I hope one day you will still know that choosing you was never the part one regretted. My hands began to tremble. I slowly lowered the letter, unable to breathe normally. Noah had written those words before graduation, before the bus station, before the morning that destroyed everything I believed about us. I looked toward him instinctively. Across the library, Noah stared at the contents of his own envelope with the same stunned expression. He reached inside again and carefully unfolded another sheet of paper. Rachel stepped closer to him, looking equally confused. Claire noticed our reactions and frowned. "Wait," she said, walking toward the table where an old inventory list still rested inside the metal box. She studied it for several seconds before covering her mouth. "Oh no." Every conversation around the room slowly quieted. Claire looked from me to Noah with growing disbelief. When we packed the time capsule after graduation, the volunteers accidentally switched 2 envelopes. My heartbeat seemed to stop completely. Claire swallowed hard before continuing. "Ethan, the letter you opened was supposed to belong to Noah. Noah, the envelope you have was supposed to belong to Ethan." The library became perfectly silent. I looked down again and noticed something I had completely missed. Tucked beneath Noah's letter were 2 faded bus tickets held together by a paper clip and an old folded sketch on notebook paper. With shaking hands, I opened the drawing. It was a rough pencil sketch of a tiny apartment with 2 coffee mugs sitting beside a window. Across the bottom, in Noah's handwriting, were 5 words that shattered the last certainty I had left. Our first home. Do not forget. For several long seconds, nobody in the library moved. I stared at the sketch in my hands while the edges of the paper blurred through unexpected tears. It was impossible. Every memory I had protected for 10 years insisted that Noah had walked away from me without looking back. Yet the letter, the bus tickets, and the tiny apartment he had imagined before graduation belonged to a version of him that had been planning a future with me until the very last moment. I slowly lifted my eyes. Noah was already looking at me, holding another sheet of paper that had slipped from the envelope meant for me. His expression carried the same disbelief that I felt. "There's another letter," he said quietly. His voice trembled just enough for me to notice. "It was folded behind yours." Rachel stepped closer, gently touching his arm. "Noah." He unfolded the page with careful hands. The paper looked newer than the first letter, as though it had been written sometime after graduation. He swallowed before reading the first lines silently to himself. Whatever he saw caused every trace of color to leave his face. "What is it?" I asked before I realized I had spoken out loud. Noah looked at me for a long moment. "I wrote this 3 months later." The room remained silent as he handed the page to me. I accepted it carefully. The handwriting was rushed, uneven, completely different from the hopeful letter I had just finished reading. "I came back to Westbrook today. I went to the bus station first because part of me still believed I would find you waiting. Then I went to your house. The neighbors told me your family had moved away 2 weeks earlier. I do not know where you are. I do not know if you hate me. I only know that I was too late. If this letter ever reaches you, please believe one thing. I never chose to leave you." My hands began shaking again. I read the final sentence twice before lowering the page. "Noah." My voice barely existed. Rachel took a slow breath and looked at both of us with tears gathering in her own eyes. "There is something you both deserve to know." Noah turned toward his sister without speaking. She hesitated, as though she had carried the weight of this moment for years. "The night before graduation, Dad found out about the 2 of you." My heart sank. Rachel continued softly. "He believed that if Noah left town immediately, everything would become just another high school memory. Before sunrise, he drove Noah to Chicago to stay with our uncle. Noah wanted to call you, but Dad took his phone away." I closed my eyes as the missing pieces slowly began falling into place. Rachel's voice grew quieter. "A few weeks later, Noah wrote the first letter and asked me to mail it. I promised I would. But before I could, Dad found it in my room. He burned it and told me never to contact you again." Noah lowered his head. It was obvious this was the first time he had heard that part of the story. Rachel wiped a tear from her cheek. When Noah came back 3 months later, he wrote another letter. This time he mailed it himself. "But your family had already moved." My thoughts raced toward my mother. We had left Westbrook so suddenly after graduation because she had accepted a teaching position in Seattle. We never left a forwarding address. Noah had not known where to find me. I had never known he was searching. We had spent 10 years believing the other person had made a choice that neither of us had ever made. I looked at Noah across the quiet library. The distance between us was only a few feet, yet suddenly felt like every mile we had traveled separately over the past decade. Neither of us had abandoned the other. We had simply become 2 young men whose future had been rewritten by decisions we were never allowed to make ourselves. The library slowly filled with quiet conversations again, but I could not hear any of them. The letters remained in my hands, heavier now than paper had any right to be. I looked at Noah one last time, before turning toward the exit. I did not say a word. I simply walked away. No one tried to stop me. The cool night air hit my face the moment I stepped outside, carrying the familiar scent of damp leaves and distant rain. The school parking lot shimmered beneath rows of streetlights, their reflections stretching across the pavement after a brief autumn drizzle. I kept walking without deciding where I was going. My feet seemed to remember the roads my heart had forgotten. Every step unraveled another certainty I had carried for 10 years. I had believed Noah abandoned me. He had believed I disappeared without a goodbye. We had both built entire lives around a lie neither of us created. I reached the old bus station at the edge of town before I even realized where I had gone. It looked smaller than it had when I was 18. The wooden benches had been replaced with metal ones, and the faded ticket booth had become a small coffee stand that had already closed for the night. Only a single overhead light remained on, casting a warm circle across the empty platform. I stopped beneath it, remembering the morning I had stood there with one backpack, 2 bus tickets, and enough hope to fill an entire lifetime. Back then, I had watched every arriving bus with excitement, until excitement slowly became confusion, then disappointment, and finally silence. I had left believing love had chosen someone else. I sat on the cold bench, holding the faded bus tickets that had been hidden inside Noah's envelope. They were for 2 seats on the 6 o'clock bus to Seattle. My name was written on one, his on the other. He really had planned to leave with me. A quiet sound of footsteps echoed behind me. I knew who it was before I turned around. Noah stopped several feet away instead of walking closer. His hands rested inside the pockets of his coat, and his shoulders rose and fell with a slow, steady breath. Neither of us spoke immediately. The silence felt different now. It was no longer filled with accusation. It was filled with everything we had lost. "I almost followed you," Noah finally admitted. Then I realized I spent too much of my life making decisions for both of us, even when I believed I was protecting you. He looked toward the empty road where buses no longer passed at this hour. I did not want to do that again. I lowered my eyes to the tickets in my hands. "So why did you come?" He smiled sadly. "Because there was one thing I never said when we were 18. His voice remained calm, carrying no expectation, no pressure, only honesty. "I cannot give us back those 10 years, Ethan. I cannot erase the birthdays we missed, the conversations we never had, or the people we became without each other. But I can finally tell you the truth without anyone standing between us." He paused, letting the words settle into the quiet night. "I never stopped loving you." My chest tightened so suddenly that I struggled to breathe. Every part of me wanted to run from the pain of what could have been. Another part wanted to believe that love could survive even after so much silence. Noah remained exactly where he was. He did not reach for me. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply waited. "Last time," he said softly, "other people decided our future before we had the chance to choose it ourselves. Tonight, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking you to stay. I am only asking you to make your own choice this time." I looked at the bus tickets once more before slowly standing. My feet carried me forward one careful step at a time until only a few inches separated us. Without saying anything, I reached toward his wrist and gently touched the old leather bracelet that had survived 10 years when everything else had fallen apart. Noah looked down at my hand, then back into my eyes. For the first time since graduation, the next moment belonged to neither our past nor anyone else's decisions. It belonged entirely to us. Neither of us spoke for what felt like a very long time. My fingers rested lightly against the worn leather bracelet, feeling the tiny cracks that 10 years had carved into its surface. It had aged just as we had, marked by time, but never broken. Noah looked at me with the same quiet patience I had once seen whenever I doubted one of my paintings before an art competition. Only now I understood something I had been too hurt to recognize before. He was not waiting for forgiveness. He was waiting for my decision. I slowly let my hand fall and released a breath I felt as though I had been holding since I was 18 years old. "I cannot pretend those 10 years never happened," I said. "Neither can I," Noah answered immediately. "And I would never ask you to." I nodded, grateful that he did not offer impossible promises. "There were days when I hated you," I admitted. "There were birthdays when I wondered if you had forgotten my name. There were moments when I almost believed none of it had been real." Noah lowered his eyes. "I know. No," I said gently. "You know your side of those years. I know mine. They were both lonely in different ways." He looked back at me, and for the first time that evening I saw something other than regret in his expression. I saw hope, careful and fragile, refusing to disappear. Then maybe we should not try to recover the people we were, he said. Maybe we should get to know the people we became. I smiled before I even realized I was doing it. It was small, uncertain, but completely real. That sounds terrifying. He laughed softly, and hearing that familiar laugh after so many years felt strangely like coming home, without erasing the journey that had brought me there. Would you have dinner with me tomorrow? He asked. Not to relive high school. Not to fix everything in one night. Just dinner. I considered the question carefully. 10 years earlier, I would have answered without thinking. Now I understood that love deserved honesty more than speed. One dinner, I replied. And one condition. Anything. No more deciding what is best for me without asking me first. His answer came without hesitation. Never again. We walked back toward the parking lot together, not holding hands, not pretending the distance between us had vanished, but no longer walking in opposite directions. The road ahead was uncertain, yet for the first time uncertainty did not feel like loss. It felt like possibility. Over the following months, we learned each other again through ordinary moments instead of dramatic promises. Noah visited Seattle whenever his projects allowed. I traveled to Chicago during school breaks. We spoke honestly when old fears returned instead of hiding them behind silence. Sometimes we laughed about memories that had survived the years. Sometimes we cried over the ones that had not. Neither of us expected healing to happen all at once, and perhaps that was why it slowly did. 1 year later, I opened my first public art exhibition. The largest painting stood alone in the center of the gallery. It showed a quiet bus station beneath the first light of morning. 2 empty tickets rested on the bench, while 2 figures walked away together toward a sunrise that had only just begun. The title on the small plaque beneath the canvas read, 6 o'clock. When the guests gathered around it, Noah quietly slipped his hand into mine. This time neither of us let go. As I looked at the painting, I finally understood something that had taken half my life to learn. First love is not always the person who stays. Sometimes it is the person who teaches you that the truth can arrive years late, that forgiveness begins with understanding, and that the future should never be decided by the fears of the past. We never recovered the 10 years we lost, but we stopped allowing those lost years to steal the rest of our lives.